Good evening, everyone. This is David Mandel at OL Children's Home and Family Services, and welcome to this evening's webinar on reimagining grief. Beginning several years ago with the onset of COVID, OL introduced these webinar conversations dealing with very difficult issues in our community that COVID impacted, so much trauma, grief, difficult situations for families. Approximately once every 3 weeks, we introduce another conversation related to the issue. Just this past weekend, over Shabbat, my colleagues Sivi Ryder, Dr. Norman Blumenthal, and Cheryl Shanowski had a weekend with 43 couples who unfortunately each lost an adult child over the age of 18. And they spent a weekend together discussing those issues that affect individuals, whether that child was lost to any circumstance of death, whether that child was lost within the past year, many years ago, and how it affects people's lives. And my colleagues told me that it was an exceptional weekend. Hard to imagine the grief and the difficulty, and at the same time, the uplifting, the strength that people got from each other. This evening, also 2 months ago, because we discussed so many difficult issues, we also had a webinar on happiness, how people can achieve happiness, especially during difficult times in their life. And we had a great conversation with an author, with a very renowned professor on the issue of happiness. I want to thank my colleagues at Sivi Ryder, Cheryl Shanowski, and Laura Bart for organizing this evening and all such evenings. Tonight we're discussing, under the conversation of reimagining grief, grieving a grandchild, the loss of a grandchild, how it impacts grandparents and the immediate and extended family. I'm very pleased that we have a very important, distinguished panelist this evening, Dr. Debbie Ackerman, Rebbetzin Leah Brown, Rabbi Yisrael Leigh Burstein, and Dr. Norman Blumenthal, my colleague at OHEL. I'll be introducing each one of them. We invite you all, everyone in the audience, to share with us any questions that you may have on the chat, on your screen, on the bottom of your screen or the side, however you set up. You can ask the question privately or publicly that everyone will see. And we will see your questions, including if you ask them on a private chat or on the Q&A, and we will pose as many questions as possible. We also received a number of questions in advance of this evening. So let me begin by introducing Dr. Debbie Ackerman, a licensed clinical social worker, a doctorate in social welfare, who specializes in the treatment of addictions, both behavioral addictions and chemical addictions. Dr. Ackerman is in private practice in northern New Jersey and is also full-time on the faculty at Wirtzweiler School of Social Work of Yeshiva University. And this is an amazing piece of your bio, Dr. Ackerman, who's the proud mother of 11 biological children, 8 stepchildren, and a number of fabulous grandchildren. Thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Ackerman.
Thank you.
Share with us a conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate this. First of all, this is really an important topic, and I'm grateful to be here. Thank you. So just kind of a way of a little bit of background. I got divorced in April of 2012, and in September of that year, my oldest son took ill. He had actually been ill, and he was diagnosed with brain cancer in that September. I actually met my husband a month later, which definitely for me was the refuah before the makkah, and we got married Purim of 2013. Unfortunately, my son passed away Rosh Hashanah 6 months later, right after we got married, he went back into the hospital and never got out. I don't have to tell people here, I don't have to tell Dr. Blumenthal or you, Mr. Mandel, the amount of devastation that is. It's immeasurable. I will say that during that time I was working for OHEL, and Dr. Blumenthal literally saved me. I confided in one person, it was him. And I cannot tell you how kind and generous he was with me. It was an unbelievable godsend. So we kind of went through that first year. Very, very difficult, newly married, 19 kids, a son that just passed away. It was not pretty. And 15 months later on Hanukkah, my stepson got married the last night of Hanukkah. And we all went, and it was really wonderful. And the next day, I was actually driving to OHEL, and I was on the phone with my oldest daughter, talking about the important things of life. Did I look thin at the wedding? How was it? How good did I look? How good did everybody look? And she said, I have to go. It's my husband. I said, sure. And she clicked off and called me back 2 minutes later. And she said, come quick. Batsheva, my granddaughter, has been hit by a car. Come meet me. And she hung up the phone. And I said, you know what? I can do this. I've just spent a year in the hospital. I can call people. I can get care. I can get meals. I know how to do this. And I called my husband, who was working at Woodhull Hospital at the time. And I ran to meet him, kept trying to call my daughter. She wouldn't answer, but I'm making a million phone calls. I'm a social worker. We always have 49 tabs open in our brain. I was getting ready to coordinate everything. And I got to Woodhull. It was the last day of Hanukkah. It also happened to be Christmas Eve, so traffic was ridiculous. And I called my daughter, and she said, it's over. Batsheva died. I do remember hearing this incredible, piercing scream that came from me, although at the moment I didn't know it. And I really think for the first time in my life, something really flipped. I was at Woodhull, so the subway tracks are there and there's stores, and everything kind of flipped on its head. It went upside down. The subway track flipped. There was a store, I think Modell's, it flipped. And I was just standing in the parking lot screaming my head off, an empty parking lot. I don't know where anybody was. And I called my husband in, and we sped off to Lakewood for the funeral. But I kind of want to share with the audience and kind of my interesting take on it. And I guess I have the dubious distinction of having lost both a child and a grandchild within a year and a half. At that very moment, my grief was arrested. And the only thing I could think about, the only thing I could focus on is that my daughter cannot suffer the way I suffered, that I have to do every last thing in my power to help her, that there is just no way I can allow her to just drown in the amount of grief that I had been in for that year. What I was going to do, I had no idea. But that was kind of like the driving thought that I had and continued to have. And it was almost like I just wanted to pour myself into her and just take everything that she was feeling away. In therapy, we talk about shared experience. And this was definitely a remarkable, horrible shared experience. I'm very close with my children. We're all close, but I have to say that my daughter and I just kind of have bonded over something quite horrible. But definitely, I think we have a very unique understanding of each other. So that's kind of where the story kind of begins and ends. I'm very happy to converse, to do anything that I can do to help anybody else in this situation. And I do thank you for this opportunity.
I, amongst many individuals, just need to take a deep breath. And there were two words that you said, a piercing scream. You're a social worker. We've often heard how a shrill, a piercing scream can be good in some way. Not at that moment of the pain, but screaming in certain situations can be positive. I hope I'm not overstating it.
No.
Right now. There's a certain healing to a piercing scream, especially if you're alone in a parking lot in a very difficult time.
True. I think it reminded me that I was still there and alive. Everything was so surreal, completely surreal, that hearing that scream kind of jarred me into I'm still here, like that I'm literally here. So it was, yeah, it was definitely more than cathartic.
Debbie, take a moment, please, to explain shared experience, what that means beyond what many people may be thinking that you and your daughter each lost a child, unfortunately. What do you mean by shared experience?
Well, in the therapeutic world, and I hope Dr. Blumenthal is not grading me here because I want to always impress him. When you talk about a shared experience, the way I understand it really comes from Carl Jung, the wounded healer, and where he posited that it was really for physicians, but it extends out to therapists, that if you've gone through something, if you've actually felt it, if you've actually felt what it means to have, an elephant dancing on your chest at 3 o'clock in the morning when you pop up from terror, that somebody can explain it to you, but to actually be there, to actually have felt it, it gives you just this greater level of empathy, right? Because what somebody says to you, it's not just words anymore. You've physically felt it, you have incorporated it, it's something that's with you. And the moment I heard that my granddaughter died, I just knew that I have to save my daughter. There was nothing else in my mind, but she has to be okay. She's my daughter. And I remember arriving to the funeral. We buried my granddaughter that night, and there she was. She was so small, my daughter, and all in black. And I just wanted to pick her up and hold her like she was my baby. And she's a mother, she has children. And I cannot explain to you how I just literally wanted to cradle her and hold her and just take that pain and put it into me. Like I knew what that pain was. And the thought of her going through it was too much to bear. It was just too much for me to handle. And that's really what shared experience is. It's, you don't even need words. You just simply understand what that other person is going through. And if I may, for 2 more minutes, about 3 months after my granddaughter died, I went on this kind of every 2 hour or hour schedule of calling my daughter, like almost like a nursing baby. Starting from 6 o'clock in the morning, I was on this rotation of calling her. And she took a leave of absence from work, and either she answered the phone or she didn't, but I just wanted her to know that I'm there. And 3 months later, we decided we'd meet up. We would just go have lunch and spend an afternoon together. And we met at a mall. She came from Lakewood, I came from Passaic, and we kind of went like this. And it was the oddest thing. It was like two strangers meeting. We were walking through IKEA in that basement. It's like 3 football fields. And we were having the most inane conversation. Oh, do you like shower curtains? Oh, yes, I like shower curtains. Do you like the gray one? Oh, yes, I like the gray one. Should we buy the blue towels? Yes, let's buy the blue towels. Like we don't know each other. And we walked around like that for an hour. And then we finally sat down and, Jewish mother, we brought food and we started eating and we looked at each other and we just started crying. We just both broke down and started crying. And then it kind of melted. We kept walking through the mall and we passed the store that had handbags, and we're still kind of having this conversation. And my daughter said, "You like this bag?" I said, "Yeah, it's really nice." She said, "Let me buy it for you." I said, "No, I'm really okay." She said, "Please let me buy this for you." I said, "Chava, I'm really all right." And she said, "You don't understand. I have to do something for somebody. I have to give you something." And to me, it was very much like that Viktor Frankl moment, Man's Search for Meaning. And I said, "Okay, thank you. I really appreciate this bag. That's very kind." And I still have it. It's in my closet. I used it. It's definitely worn out now. I'm never getting rid of it because that bag to me represented hope, and that she was going to be okay, and that there was some glimmer of future that she could have. And that's what I mean by shared experience. You feel it. It's just completely a part of you in every way.
Dr. Ackerman, that was a very descriptive conversation. Thank you. And you used the word empathy, which I want to get back to a little bit later.
Sure.
It's my pleasure to introduce Rebbetzin Leah Brown of Rebbetzin in Far Rockaway, Queens, who proudly mentions that her husband is Rav Moshe Brown of the Aguda, and who I've had the privilege of knowing Rebbetzin Brown and Rav Moshe Brown. And Rebbetzin Brown is also a college teacher and joins us this evening to speak about a profound losses in her family. Rebbetzin Brown, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Rebbetzin Brown, you're on mute. Rebbetzin.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. I have the dubious distinction of having lost 4 grandchildren, different circumstances, which I will describe. I consider them Yisurim Shel Ava. They came straight from Hashem, and it's just a unique opportunity to develop a closeness to the one above. I relive this time in my life all the time, but preparing for this panel was just brought everything flooding back in a different way, and sometimes in some ways a more painful way. So the story of what happened, just very generally, is one of my children, a son and daughter-in-law, they lost 3 children, 3 babies, different ages. Their first they lost, she was about 5 months old. Around when she was 4 months old, they started noticing different things. She was in and out of the hospital. This is over Pesach. Baruch Hashem, at least for the storm, they were with us. After Pesach, she went back into the hospital, and about a week later, she deteriorated very quickly, and about a week later, she was gone. Shocking. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know what happened. I remember my son in the hospital. We were in Columbia Presbyterian, and it was like a circle of rooms around the nurse's station, beautiful rooms. And my son said to me, I don't know how anyone does this without amun and bitachon. If you think that this is random, you can't survive it. It's so difficult to survive in any way. They sat Shiva in our house afterwards, and I saw how each of my kids really, I had a young family at the time, and each of my kids were very affected in their own different way. I had a high school daughter. She would not go to school the entire week. She just stayed home. She didn't want anyone scrutinizing her, looking at her, asking her questions. She stayed home. She would not go to school that week. It was, I saw each one of them, how they reacted. And it was my job also, besides my own devastation, I had to take care of them and make sure that they were getting through this in the best way possible. The second baby was born. That baby lasted about 13 months. It was a really hard time. Till about 4 months also, she was okay. And then we saw the deterioration. They came to us, or my daughter-in-law's parents, every single Shabbos. They did not want to be alone if something happened. So they just came to us every Shabbos. One of my daughters and I, one of my teenagers, also this baby did not sleep, cried constantly. So we took turns to having this baby at night so that my kids could get a break and get some sleep. Just trying to keep everything normal. We married off a couple kids during this time. Very, very difficult. You're in 2 places, sometimes physically, but always emotionally. Being with the kids who are suffering and being with the simcha, it's just really, it's very hard to divide yourself in that way. Then they had another child who is grown up today. Then they had a third one that lived for about 7 months. And then they had another one who also is grown up today. The fourth grandchild that we lost was almost 20 years old. She was about 3 months shy of 20 years old. Her first yahrzeit was about a few weeks ago. She was born also with problems. By the time she was 3, she was on total life support, totally not responsive at all, total life support. All through those years, there was a lot of crises all the time, hospitalizations and heart issues and bringing her back and CPR and sepsis and infections. And they were always expecting that phone call. She kept coming back. We kept calling her the child with 100 lives. She kept coming back. She had to be here. Hashem wanted her to be here for whatever reason. And she just kept coming back. But one day they did get that phone call that she was gone. One morning, middle of the morning, total shock. As much as they were expecting it, total shock. When we walked back into the house after that levaya, my son said to me, "Mommy, this is the fourth time that you're doing this." And it hit me with, it was such an insight, because yes, he's sitting Shiva and his brother sat Shiva, and they were very close, and all my kids are very supportive of each other. But it all comes back to my husband and me, my machatanim. We're suffering every single time, in not exactly the same way, but in a similar way. It's a grandchild for us, and it all like points back to us. It brought everything, when he said that, it brought everything flooding back, all the years of what was going on before. So I just want to share a few different little stories and insights that happened through those years. Those first, the three babies, it was over just about a 10-year period, from the beginning till the end. But it was going, it was constant things going on. So first of all, I feel that anyone who's been through any nisayon, any challenge, any tzara, any difficulty, they have a certain something that they could connect to someone else, whether it's the same, and even something that seems the same is never the same. Circumstances, gender, type, relationship, there's so many differences, but all those, anybody who has something like that, anything, you see that they can connect and they can help another person who has also a tzara, something going, some difficulty. I saw that very clearly each time my children sat Shiva, that when they came in, when anyone came in who had some loss or in some way, they were able to give a deeper nachama to my kids than other people. Not that they could change it or fix it, but it was a way of connecting that they had that was different. As my son, the psychologist, said, a tzara or an isayon can really create a reservoir of emotion that helps you connect with someone else. Another thing, when you have young couples that get married and they come home and they bring in the baby and the soup and the car seat and the stroller and the diapers and all the paraphernalia, it's so amazing, it's so beautiful. They come in for Shabbos or Yom Tov, whatever it is, and then my children lost their child. So then they come by themselves. It was beautiful to have them, but very sad and very hard to watch that. Then it happens again. They come in with all their stuff and the baby, and we're hopeful. And then again, they come empty-handed. Very painful experience to watch that. I said this, I tried to keep things very normal for my family. I did have these younger kids. I remember one point I decided to paint their bedroom, one of the kids' bedrooms. And the whole time I'm doing this and other things like this, I kept thinking, are you nuts? Are you crazy? You're picking paint colors and a baby is dying in your house. Like, how can you even do that? But I did, and I had to keep as much as I can. You can't put everything on hold while something like this is going on, and for such a long time. When the first baby was nifter, passed away, so we got the phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the levaya was going to be that day, and we had to make a quick decision. It was all going to be graveside. My youngest was in first grade, the next one was in third grade. I had to make a decision to send them to school or bring them with us. I couldn't imagine bringing them, having them see this small coffin and all the adults crying and I didn't want to do it. So today you would immediately call the school, call the teacher. First of all, it wasn't done so much in those days, but second of all, I didn't have time for it. I couldn't think, and I didn't have time to make decisions and check with somebody if this was the right thing. So I sent them to school. Big mistake. The teacher, who was a friend of mine, she actually knew that the baby was sick, but she didn't know that it was fatal, and we didn't know it, so nobody else knew really. So my daughter, my first grader, was sitting in school at her desk and crying, and the teacher went over to her and said, "Terry, what's the matter? Why are you crying?" So she probably thought she was going to say, "I forgot my lunch," but no, she said, "My niece died." The poor teacher, I felt so sorry for her. Like, what's she supposed to do with that? I think such a mistake. I never should have sent them to school. Maybe I should have sent them to a friend. I shouldn't have sent them to school. Meanwhile, I never hoped to rectify that mistake, but unfortunately, Hashem sent me another situation where I was able to rectify it. The next baby, when she died, it was during the day, and the Levi was the next day. So I did have time to think about it, and I called a therapist friend. She said, what children imagine is much, much worse than what they actually would experience. Don't pressure them at all, but offer them to come, and do encourage them to come. They were 2 years older at that point also, which helps. So I went to each of them separately, and I asked them, do you want to come? Yes, an immediate yes, each of them. And we did bring them. Again, it was graveside and pretty horrible, but at least they were there. The first time they did Shiva in the house, so the kids were part of it in that way. This was not a strange baby. They knew the baby, but they did have that closure in a certain sense. But this time it was better, and they did not sit Shiva in our house. They sat in Lakewood in their own house. I went to speak once to Dr. Blumenthal. I don't know if he remembers at all, but I wanted clarity on a couple of issues. One of which was, and it was debating this, which way to go. Do I encourage my kids, even push my kids to family outings, to simchas, to be in pictures at simchas, to participate in different ways? Sometimes they wanted to, sometimes they didn't. But he didn't talk very much. He just kept pushing the tissue box towards me because I was crying a lot. But he said to me, they're adults. They have to make their own decisions. They have to do what they're comfortable with. They have to do what they feel they can do, not what you want them to do. It has nothing to do with you. You're the parent, the grandparent, but you're not, you don't have any say in this. This is for them to decide. And then how about this? The year that the first baby died, I was in Avelos. I was in the year of mourning for my mother. Something shifted, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I felt like maybe I was bumped up to the next level of Avelos. I was, I didn't know what it was. I felt different. I felt funny. I felt something was not ready. It took me a few years to figure it out. I felt guilty mourning my mother when a baby died. How could I mourn my mother? Now, it's the way of the world to bury your mother, to bury your parents, but I needed my mother so desperately at that time. I needed her so much. We were very close, but yes, it's the way of the world, and it's not the way of the world to bury a child, but no, that's not true. Of course I could mourn my mother. Of course I could be sad about my mother. The baby is a whole different story. I could be sad and mourning both of them. But I taught myself that, and through the years, that was, very helpful lesson that I taught myself. At that first Levaya, I remember thinking, it was running through my head the whole time. There's nothing worse than putting a child in the ground. There's nothing worse. There's nothing worse. Well, guess what? There is something worse. Putting two, or chas v'shalom, Rahman litzlan, more. I'll end with this. Whenever I go to a house where they're sitting Shiva for a child, I always try and find grandparents, but especially the grandmother. We are a forgotten group. We don't sit Shiva. We don't have any halachas of avelos, nothing. But we are in immense pain. First of all, we lost the child, however old they were, whatever the circumstances, we lost that child. And then we're watching our children in such terrible pain, sitting Shiva, mourning their child. It's double mourning. I wish everyone who's listening who has had this experience should have a deep nechama. And also we should all have the schus to one day really finally understand the cheshbon of Hashem, of the Borei Olam. Thank you.
Elizabeth Brown, it's unimaginable. You spoke about the loss of a child that's profound, and then you speak about multiple losses. You spoke about having a reservoir of strength as a grandparent to support your children who experience the loss. While you are grieving for your grandchild, you also, as Dr. Ackerman spoke about, you need to be there for your children. your reservoir of strength. You spoke about, as a grandparent, you are a forgotten group of people. You don't sit shiva. You don't go through the same experiences, shared experiences, if I may, Dr. Ackerman, of Everson Brown. You don't go through the same shared experiences of sitting shiva. And at the same time, you said, you have to try to lead a normal life. And you have to try to show your children, your other children, and the family that you are leading and supporting a normal life, even while you may be forgotten as a grandparent in grief. The contrast is so stark and is so important how you described it. Thank you, Everson Brown. Rabbi Burstein, you're a Rebbe in Yeshiva Ruach HaTorah for the past 20 years, and you've been in high school chinuch, an educator, Jewish educator, for 40 years. Thank you very much for joining us, Rabbi Burstein. Please. You're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Olo does a lot of good work. I want to thank Dr. Mandel and Dr. Blumenthal and the panel for giving me this opportunity to speak. It's nearly the second yahrzeit of my grandson, Shmuley Silverberg. And you can imagine, you get a phone call at 4 o'clock in the morning. Normally get a phone call, a simcha, child, a new grandchild, and you're listening to your daughter crying that her son was shot in Denver. At first we thought maybe he was injured, and then they said, no, he was killed. We realized, myself and my wife, that we're going to have very strong emotions to help our children go through this tragedy. That night, a lot of questions. No time for grief. Where are we going to bury our grandson? Eretz Yisrael, Lakewood, Cleveland. Who's going to take care of this? And so on. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. Should we go to Levi in Denver? Should we stay home? We decided that he should be buried in Lakewood. That was a very big decision for us. And then I called my Choshev son Chaim, who takes care of the Chevra Kadisha in Lakewood. He's part of the Chevra Kadisha, and he flew to Denver. That morning, I'm not a morning person usually. I went to shul at 6:15 in the morning to the early minyan, and I met one of my best friends, and I started talking to him. I needed somebody to talk to. I went home that morning, and me and my wife, we decided we're not going to Denver. The Levi is going to be in Lakewood. We're going to be in Lakewood. We stayed home the most of the day. I had to call all my children to break the news to them all over the world, Eretz Yisrael, Philadelphia, Lakewood, that they should hear about it beforehand, before we even thought about ourselves. And as the day went on, we stayed in the house most of the day. But we saw different community people step up to the plate and help us. One of my friends, we're not going to say any names, ordered lunch for us. A beautiful gesture. Some people from my neighborhood came to me to say, we're sorry. What happened? Even though it's a mission that says you're not supposed to be Menachem Avel till the mace is in the ground. But they came over and give us chizuk. There was a miracle, that's another story, that they were able to get the body of a murder victim, our grandson, out of Denver. Great rabbi over there, Rabbi Steinberg, was able to get him out. And the Levi was that night in Lakewood at 11:30 at night. There were about 1,000 people there. Yeshivas, my friends, my wife's friends, people that I'm not so close with, came to give us chizuk, which was a great chizuk for us. We sat Shiva, they sat Shiva, they live in Cleveland. We sat Shiva in my son and my daughter-in-law's house that week, and we observed the Shiva. Very hard to watch your children in Shiva. Tremendously difficult. I sat down sometimes. I wanted to find out more about my grandson because he was my grandson, but I found out what a big tzaddik he was. We stayed there Thursday, Friday, different Rosh Hashivas came. They usually called us and my mechutnin to sit down when they were talking to us. Sometimes I sat down, sometimes I did sit down. Sometimes I talked to my other children, to my other grandchildren. It was a very weird thing. Owell did not put out a book yet about how a grandparent is supposed to act by their own grandchildren's levaya. We stayed in Lakewood. My daughter from Eretz Yisrael flew in. We spent Shabbos all together at my son and my daughter-in-law's house. So we were there till Sunday morning. Different friends came. Neighbors came from Brooklyn, gave me a hug, cried with me, cried with my wife, and made us feel good that we were somebody that we're also mourning. Doing both things, trying to give chizuk to each other, and it was an unbelievable Shabbos day together. There was my father-in-law who just passed away last year, did not know about this. We had to break the news to him. So Sunday morning when my daughter and my son-in-law went back to Cleveland, we went to Muncie where he lived to break the news to him. We had somebody, a medical professional there. He was in his 90s and he spoke to him and we broke the news to him. He was okay, however he could be okay. And then we went to Cleveland. We stayed in Cleveland to the end of Shiva. When I got there, one of my Talmidim was sitting in the room. He has mishpacha there to greet me, to give me chizuk. And we stayed in Cleveland, which has an unbelievable community there. Unbelievable. We were there. There were people that called me up from Brooklyn to give us chizuk. I have a friend that lost a child himself that I called him up. He did not know. That night, he flew in from Queens, stayed with me for 2 hours, offered him to stay in the house. No, I'm staying in a hotel. Different people stepped out of their zone, not friends, called up and say, we feel with you. We want to give chizuk to you. It was an unbelievable thing. The shiva was over, I think, Tuesday morning. On the way back, one of my best Talmidim called me up and gave me chizuk, and then we came back to Brooklyn. And in Brooklyn, we had different reactions. I went to Mincha for the first time. I was saying Kaddish. I was davening. I was saying Kaddish all the time. The Rav came over to me. Some people came over to me. We're sorry. Some people said nicer things. Some people didn't say such nice things. But the fact that they came over, that gave us chizuk in ourselves. They were able to go out of their zone to talk to us, to give us chizuk. Some people I met in the street, they started crying. Some people did not talk to me at all. I felt uncomfortable. Some of my people that I know very, very well did not say anything to me. And it was extremely uncomfortable for them. And it was extremely uncomfortable for me because I thought, because I'm the one that's in pain and my wife is in pain, that they should say, start the conversation. Some people said, how are you doing? I didn't give, maybe the therapist here could say, well, you should give him the opening. I did not give him the opening. I felt that they can't say and break the ice. I'm not sure if it's halakhically correct in all the people's audience here, that I would not say something. I felt that they should go and they should say something first. It was a tremendous chizuk from a lot of people that I didn't have shaykhs with, called me up and said to me, we're with your pain. And we're able to slowly pick up the pieces. It was very hard because the next week was his brother's bar mitzvah. They had a bo bayom, which we did not attend, but we came for Shabbos. It was a very, very difficult time to have both hats, to give chizuk to our children and to receive chizuk from other people. I learned that to be more sensitive to this when a person goes through tzoros, you have to be more sensitive to go out of your zone and not that it should be that something happened bad and just pass the ketchup, please. I felt a Rosh Hashiva called me up 2 days before Rosh Hashanah and said to me, I didn't know what to say to you, but now it's before Rosh Hashanah, you should have a good job. We have to be mechazik each other. As Rebbetzin Brown said, People need chizuk, and we have to go out of our zone to give them chizuk. And that's our job in Klal Yisrael. And hopefully this webinar should people open his eyes. There are people that need chizuk. And if you could give them chizuk, you have to step up to the plate and give them chizuk. Thank you very much. I'm here. I'm here.
David, unmute. David, unmute.
You see, I remind everyone else that they're unmute me while I'm on mute. Rabbi Burstein, thank you very much. I daven in Heichel David, Rebbetzin Leah Brown's son-in-law, Rabbi Mordechai Stern, and her daughter, the Rebbetzin. And as Rebbetzin Brown mentioned before we got on the webinar, her grandson, Rabbi Rebbetzin Mordechai Stern's son, was a chaver and learned in the yeshiva where Shmuley, unfortunately, lost his life, was murdered. You spoke about how you observed the Shiva. While you were grieving for your grandson, you observed the Shiva that your children, was a very striking word, that you observed the Shiva. You know, obviously things that you will never forget. Somebody asked the question, and I want to get to Dr. Blumenthal and then come back to questions. Somebody asked the question which you answered without me asking you, who do you talk to about your feelings when you have this loss? And you said you spoke to a friend of yours. You found a good friend who you spoke to, whatever it is that you talk about. And of course, the Gemara says that a person should speak out his thoughts. Its therapist did not come up with this, revelation. You find someone who you trust, find someone who you believe is a good listener, find someone who will be empathetic and doesn't have to say a word to you. Find someone who you trust, and that's the person who you can talk to. A friend, a love, a relative, a spouse.
I want to tell you something. The one I could talk to, probably, and the only one, she's on the side, my wife. If my wife would have been there, I would have fell apart. My wife is much stronger than me. And she was the one that pulled me through this. And we spent a lot of time in the car together. And we were machazik each other. So this only was for my wife. And my daughters have a shir together every night now, 9:30 at night. They learn a sefer and living emunah, and they became much, much closer. And tragedies and simchas bring you much, much closer. And if we wouldn't have such a close family and a great family all over the world, we wouldn't have made it unless we stick together for each other.
By Burstein, that's why Mother's Day is a much bigger celebration than Father's Day. To my colleague, Dr. Norman Blumenthal, really an esteemed colleague, director of the Zakta Family National Trauma Center, a professor at Yeshiva University, and also in private practice in Cedarhurst, New York. Dr. Blumenthal, your reflections, please.
Okay, thank you very much. This is very humbling. My friend and colleague, Dr. Debbie Ackerman, described the piercing scream. I think we just heard a piercing scream. And it's whatever I say is so insignificant compared to the experiences that everybody described here. I hope what I can only do is maybe put some clinical information to organize the riveting emotions and the very instructive experiences that everybody just described. Let me start with the scream. One of the hardest things we do on the OHEL trauma team is death notification. To have to go and notify, you've all experienced it. Someone, especially sudden, all of yours, well, not, I guess, Robertson Brown, but with sudden deaths. And very often after the notification, understandably, there's screaming. There's piercing, outpouring, penetrating expression of emotion. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is to try to shush them, try to tell them to be quiet, try to talk them out of it, because that scream is very important. And my understanding of that scream is that the world as you knew it, the world that you lived in just ended. And there's a new world you're entering. And I think those screams are sort of creating that boundary of leaving one world as you then enter another world. I was also struck by Robertson Brown that your need to paint the room. I actually found that very touching. First of all, it's something to do. Sometimes when you're in these situations, you're so helpless, especially if you're the grandparent. The grandparent is one step removed and you're not as involved. So it gives you something to do, but it also, the baby, even those in those situations, they deserve a fresh room, because every minute of life is important and is precious. I heard something very interesting just this past week. I attended the levaya of a child who had been sick almost her entire life and was really, barely functioning until finally dying as an adolescent. And the father mentioned that he had a Rebbe come over to the house for a bracha. And he said to the Rebbe, could you daven for a refuah shlema? And the Rebbe said, I will daven for Yeshua shlema. And everybody here's children had a Yeshua shlema. By Burstein, you talked about the hug. Hugs are very important when someone is grieving, as you had. There's probably, for me, maybe as a bereavement specialist and a Baal Koreh, two of the words in Chumash, if you're allowed to say such things, but two of the words in Chumash that are, to me, another piercing scream, are when Aaron loses his two children amidst one of the most celebratory moments during the sojourn in the desert. And Moses extends condolences, tries to give him the chama. And the following, that's followed by the words, Vayidom Aaron. And Aaron was silent. And commentators ask, the common word for silence is shtika. It is, you say, Vayishtok Aaron. Why does it use the words Vayidom? And what they say is that shtika means you have something to say, but you keep quiet, which is something to respect. Vayidom is that deep, abiding silence when there are no words. And for the losses that all of you have experienced and what your children have experienced, there are no words, and the hugs or the crying. And I know, Rebbetzin, your son told me the story of his chavrusa from yeshiva who drove 8 hours from Baltimore to New York to sit and cry. And those are the extent, the condolences. You mentioned when someone stopped you at Reimagining, you mentioned and say, how are you doing? One of the rabbis that I've trained at Yeshiva University told me that there was a woman in his community who lost a son to suicide. He knew her, but she wasn't a member of his shul, so he wasn't so involved. But about 2 weeks later, he happened to be shopping in a supermarket and he just bumped into her. And he was a little taken aback and he said, hi, how are you? So she said to him, Rabbi, let me give you a piece of advice. The question isn't, how are you? The question is, how are you today? Very, very important lesson. Let me say a few words about this topic. First of all, I'm going to maybe pat myself on the back. I don't know, but I want to commend Ohel for addressing a topic that I don't think anyone else has yet addressed. And it's in many respects a very current topic, and embedded in it is a bracha. We are blessed today with very young and vibrant grandparents. I don't think it was so long ago when most people didn't have grandparents. I certainly didn't have grandparents, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, but even because when life expectancy was 53, there weren't that many grandparents around. Today, Baruch Hashem, we go to weddings and with full sets of grandparents and they're dancing the parents under the table. So grandparents are around, are living longer, and are very much a part of their grandchildren's lives. And just like we often mention how there's no word in English for the loss of a child, how there's no word in any language except modern Hebrew for the loss of a sibling, I don't think there's a word in any language for the loss of a grandchild. And maybe what we're starting today will help us define and identify that. But to appreciate what a loss is, you have to understand the relationship. And I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the psychology relationship between a grandparent and grandchild so we can understand better what was lost. My very wise Holocaust survivor mother, who has had a treasure trove of Yiddish sayings, when her first grandchild was born, it was my child, told me that in Europe, they used to call grandchildren Sainim from the Sainim, the enemies of the enemies. The idea being the reason why grandparents and grandchildren got along so well is that they had a mutual enemy, understood who they were. And of course, that's how she addressed my children. But there is a very special and very important relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. And I think if there's a mistake that we make, we think about grandparents as these cute, befuddled old people who are totally lost on the computer. Grandparents are a lot more important than that. First of all, grandparents represent pure indulgence. Everything you wouldn't do with your children, you wouldn't allow your children to have, you shower and drown your grandchildren with it. And it's not just, in fact, I have a shtick with my grandchildren. Whenever they do something annoying, they tickle me or they don't say hello to me or something like that, I get this very mean look on my face. And I say, call me Uppa. And I say to them, do you know what Uppa does to grandchildren who tickle him? And they already know the answer. Yeah, nothing. I said, that's right. That's exactly what I'm going to do to you. But it's a joke, but it speaks to what grandparents represent, that pure indulgence, that just giving without the discipline or without the limits. And that's very special. And I know that from not having grandparents myself, that to have that experience, and parents can't afford to do that. Parents shouldn't do that. That would be disservice to the child. And it's a very special gift for the grandparent as well, because you can do that. You can give that unadulterated love. However, when that grandchild dies, that's not available to you. But there's another piece, a grandchild, and that's so important, especially in a community like ours, a community that's a tradition-based community, which is that the grandchild is the future. Grandchild is a perpetuity. But more importantly is we don't believe that in every generation we just throw out what was in the previous generation and start afresh, as some other cultures do or communities do. For us, there's a tremendously important link between the past and the future. And when we have that connection with grandchildren, we achieve. I want to read just a few sentences from a book that was transcribed from Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik wrote very little himself, so most of what we have is what people transcribe from the speeches. But here's what he said. When it is achieved, the Masorah relationship between grandfather and grandchildren contains an emotional intensity and intellectual closeness that in some ways transcends the parent-child relationship. Psychologically, one would not expect a deep identification between two individuals whose great discrepancy of years could easily spawn alienation. Yet grandparents, more so than parents, are sensitive to the transiency of time and to the pressing need to assure the perpetuation of one's lifelong principles. The child is far more than a biological extension. He embodies one's hopes for spiritual continuity. And that hope and those promises are so cut off. There's also a sort of double grief, as was alluded to, which is you're grieving your grandchild and you're grieving your child. Many refer to this type of grief as standing shiva, because you don't sit shiva. It's not the halacha, and halacha is important, but you're part of the shiva, and as Rebbetzin Brown described, going to the kitchen, seeking out the grandmother in order to spend time with her. But I would like to propose to you that you're not just bystanders. And in the instances of the death of a grandchild, you're very, very important. First of all, very often your role, and sometimes that's frustrating, is secondary. You're the one taking care of the rest of the kids while the parents are in the hospital. You're the one maintaining the routine when the parents are sitting shiva. That is so important, especially for the family. The maintenance of the routine is so much a part of the nechama. And when you can get the kids ready and get them off to school, or when you can cook a few meals when the parents are themselves are just so not themselves, to be able to keep the routine going, that is indispensable, extremely important. But there's another piece that I want to propose, and I hope I can describe it well, that I think is a very important role that grandparents play in the unwanted and God forbid event of the death of a grandchild. First of all, again, I go back to the uniqueness of your role. You're not, if there's that tragedy, yes, you're grief-stricken beyond description. There's a different grief than the parents' grief. You're not usually struggling with the guilt not because they did anything wrong, but guilt because the death of the child is an assault on the parent as a protected figure. You don't have to worry about the other siblings. You're free of those distractions. But the other thing is, and I find this very interesting, kind of go back to what I mentioned earlier, that one of our tasks on the OHIL trauma team is to do death notification. And sometimes we've had to notify grandparents. Sometimes we have to notify older people. As Rabbi Bernstein mentioned with his father-in-law, we always make sure Hatzalah is right around the corner. We never needed them. Not only that, I found that there was a certain profundity with which the older people, which grandparents, take these events that are unique from when we have to notify younger people. Grandparents have a lot of life experience. Grandparents also have that broader vision. They've been through a lot. They've connected to their previous generations and they're connecting to the next generations. They can represent and span 4 or 5 generations. They have a certain perspective that perhaps the children don't have, and believe it or not, even though you might feel marginalized, in these situations, your adult children are looking at you. They're reading your body language, they're listening to your voice, and they're absorbing that understanding and that perspective on human beings' resilience, on the mysterious workings of Hashem that were alluded to earlier. I think one of the most fascinating Rashis in Chumash, a commentator in the Bible, is one of the Rashi, famous commentator. One of his most interesting comments comes from the verse by Yefko So Aviv, when his father cried for him. When Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, he was mourning, and it says, the Bible says, and his father cried for him. And we naturally think they're referring to Jacob, to Yaakov. Rashi explains to us, no, it wasn't Jacob, it was Isaac, it was Yitzchak, it was the grandfather. And the grandfather knew that Joseph was alive. And for some mysterious reason, which could be a lesson unto itself, he couldn't tell his son Yaakov. And he goes on to describe that he would come to Yaakov, who was sitting Shiva in mourning, and cry with him. And then he would leave fully aware that Yosef was really alive. And I think this Rashi so brilliantly captures what is the experience of a grandparent. On the one hand, you're crying for your child too. You're crying with your child. On the other hand, you have some understanding, you have a perspective on the workings of life that they don't understand and that can govern your behavior. Now, we don't have divine inspiration to know something like Isaac did know, Yitzchak did know, but we understand and we know, and we can be very, very important. And whether it comes to something of this magnitude or, God willing, more likely some of the lighter life events or challenges, I don't think grandparents should ever feel that they're just this entertaining sideliners. You're very important. You have a great deal of life experience and a lot to contribute and to help both your children and their other grandchildren in the event of anything of what happens. I hope these remarks are helpful.
Dr. Blumenthal, it's always incredible to listen to you, the range and depth of your conversation. I'm thinking about what Rabbi Bernstein said about how he spoke to his wife and how his wife was so important, saved him at that very delicate moment. I'm thinking about individuals who may be widows or widowers, who don't have a spouse, or a divorcee and doesn't have that close person to share with. Rabbi Soloveitchik said that when his wife died from a very difficult cancer, he had only one place to turn to, and he turned to Hashem. And that was the only place where he found comfort and solace. And that was the only person that he could talk to. So that's what Rav Soloveitchik turned to. I have a friend who has an expression, because the word emunah was said several times. I have a friend who has an expression, emunaholic. Dr. Ackerman, you're a specialist in behavioral addiction and in chemical addiction. No one needs to be a specialist in emunaholics. You just have to become one. Emunaholic.
Like it.
Well, you started your conversation by talking about parents who've lost a child and are grieving, that sometimes people around them try to help them and protect them and suppress them from speaking. I want to ask you the opposite. We normally go until from 8 to 9. I want to go just a few more minutes. I want to get 1 or 2 important questions in. I want to turn that around, Dr. Blumenthal. What about the parents who've lost a child? You lost a grandchild, and you're watching that your children are not demonstrably grieving, and you know that they are. Should you help them? Should you prompt them? Or is your place to be quiet?
There's the old line of any of us who are grandparents know that, keep your mouth shut and your wallet open, right? You don't intervene, you model, or you make yourself available if they turn to you. It's a very risky proposition to so directly offer advice. To children, if you can try. I mean, I think Dr. Ackerman's description of her meeting in the mall and the pocketbook was a very good description of how we help one another. It's not directly through the words. It's through the symbolism. It's through the actions. I have gone to shivas where I don't say a word, and then I ask the person before I leave if I can give them a hug. That's it. There's a beautiful story that I cited it on the weekend about Beethoven, who had a student who lost a child and she couldn't grieve. And he invited her to his house and he didn't say a word. He just played music. And from the music, she suddenly freed up and she could grieve. I think that's what we do, is we play music. We connect on a visceral level. Because most of what we're talking about now, losing 4 grandchildren, losing a child and a grandchild, a murder in Denver, there are words for that. It's Vayida Maran. And we have a silent connection and presence.
Dr. Ackerman, let me do a couple of quick questions and some quick answers, please. Dr. Ackerman, we know that it's important to keep the memory alive, to mention the name, to celebrate whatever, not only the yahrzeit, but maybe a birthday. To what extent should you be keeping pictures in the house of the grandchild that passed away? What extent should you keep talking about them to your other grandchildren? You have kinahara, a very large family. Or at what point is someone going to say, Bubby, please, enough already?
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked that, because one of the things that I guess struggle and always want people to know is it's not just Baruch, but it was Baruch and Batsheva. Like, don't ever forget one of them. It's my son Baruch, it's my granddaughter Batsheva. So don't ever say one without saying the other. It's just this very deep need I have that everybody needs to know. It's not just my son, but it's my granddaughter also. It's like a unit. I have both of their pictures that I blew up very large. They hang above my fireplace. I guess you want to call it the Wailing Wall. I don't know. We don't ever stop talking. They're alive. They're kept alive. They have to be alive. I have my son's shoes and a pair of glasses of his, and next to that I have a bag with Batsheva's outfit, the last outfit she wore when I saw her. My daughter gave it to me. You can't stop talking because they're a part of you, and that is a disservice, and it's disrespectful to them and to the rest of your family, and that just buries something that shouldn't be buried. We need to talk. We need to laugh. We need to share all of those experiences. I need to tell my kids about the macaroni that Batsheva ate when she was there that last time, or how Baruch was the last time we saw him. It has to be kept alive always.
But listen, we talked about empathy, and we talked about Shiva and some things that people say that they shouldn't say. And we know that many people, as Dr. Blumenthal said, don't speak at all. We've heard it from many Rosh Hashivas that you come, you sit down, you don't say a word, you cry and you leave. You've sat Shiva, unfortunately, as a grandparent a number of times. As I've ever seen, you've paid many Shiva calls. Can you give us an example of 2 or 3 words that are, there's no such thing as the best word. Can you give us an example of 2 or 3 words or concepts that people should learn from you about saying the right thing at a Shiva house?
I wish. It's so individual each time. I mean, I remember something that people shouldn't say. Once in front of my children, the first baby, a young woman was sitting there and said to my daughter-in-law, she says, "Does your husband really care?" In other words, we was discussing it afterwards, like, I guess her husband isn't paying so much attention to her baby, so their baby, so how could he really care? This is only a 5-month-old baby. Why should he really care? We were like horrified, but really the best thing is not to talk. If people feel they have to talk, they have to say, they have to contribute in some way. You really don't. Coming, and the person who drove and just sat and cried with my son, yeah, that's very comforting. There isn't any particular thing. Some people are good talkers. The people who are sitting Shiva could be good talkers, and they encourage people to respond to them and say different things. There's no set thing at all. It's such an individual thing each time.
Somebody just wrote such a good comment on the chat to add to the conversation about the extended family that's impacted, the cousins, the aunts and uncles, the other individuals, that we should remember to include them in the conversation, to involve them in whatever way we can, to check on them. How are they doing? First cousins, nephews, aunts and uncles who are so much involved in the loving family. We should remember that they are also grieving in a quiet or a profound way. We don't want to say that we are paying a Shiva call on them. Like Rabbi Burstein said, you're observing the Shiva, observe peripherally the other family members that are sitting Shiva. Rabbi Burstein, the second Yotzeit is coming up of your grandson, of Shmuley. Forgive me if I'm not using the right word. When is the Yotzeit coming up?
Yud Aleph Elul.
Yud Aleph Elul. Just a little bit more than a month, and a month and a half.
Yes.
How are you celebrating it?
I think they're making they make a Siyum Hashas in Cleveland, and actually they called me up because I'm the guy to learn Shas once a year. I don't like really telling people about this, and they said they needed to learn somebody to learn the last 6 prakim in Chulin. Could you please do it? So I said, okay, I'll do it. Yes, I have a picture, an interesting picture that Mrs. Ackerman, the doctor, said that I have a picture of a wedding that one of the photographers was a very good photographer. He was a little nutty, but he was a good photographer. And we have one named Shmuel that's in the family. So all the Shmuels, that was my father's name, got together. So it's right over my couch. So when I get up early to learn Shabbos morning, I usually check in with that picture to keep that reminder that he's still in my heart. He's still there. We have a picture. There was one of my cousins gave a Sefer Torah for Derech Chaim, and he donated Bamidbar for him because his daughter was in Eretz Yisrael when my children were there, the Silverbergs, and she hung out in their house all the time. And she convinced her father, this is a mishpacha, you have to give a Sefer Torah for the Bamidbar. We have that. We try to remember him all the time. We try to talk about him. Sometimes we have to be careful who to talk about it in front of, but we don't know how we're spending it. It's really, as Dr. Blumenthal said, we have to see what our children want us to do, and then we try to play the game. It's not a game, it's we try to be there for what they want. And
Yeah.
if they want us, we're coming. If they think they don't need us, then we don't come. And we don't get insulted. We understand it's about keeping your distance, but being there on call all the time.
The grandparent who expects their daughter or daughter-in-law to name the new baby after a certain name should not be involved. And your message here is check with your children what role they would like you to have in the yahrzeit. And I love the story that you learn a complete shas every year. And for this, you were challenged to learn 6 prakim. I hope you're able to accomplish that, Rabbi Burstein.
I'm in the middle of Chula now. I'm nearly up to the 6th prakim, actually.
Okay, fellow. It has been a remarkable conversation about a very difficult topic, and I would just like to quote something that Dr. Blumenthal often says to my colleagues, to our colleagues, that when you're dealing with such heavy, difficult conversations, you also have to have some humor. So people should understand that no one was, God forbid, making light or joke of anything, but there has to be a smile. There has to be some lightness. That's one of the ways that we paint the room that Rebbetzin Brown was speaking about. There are many ways to paint the room. We thank everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
There is an evaluation that everyone is going to get that will take you literally 3 minutes to complete, so we could learn from you what are the topics, what are the conversations we should have. Dr. Ackerman, Rebbetzin Brown, Rabbi Burstein, Dr. Blumenthal, thank you so much for joining us this evening,
Thank you.
and everyone should be safe and be well. Have a good night.
Thank you.